Once upon a time, long before this channel, I wrote a little review on Steam for Resident Evil Village. My thesis statement, if you'll allow me to be dramatic, was this: Resident Evil Village hits its mark. I just wish they'd aim a little higher. Now, I scored that game at a solid 7.5 to 8 out of 10 in my rating system that would sit very comfortably as fluffy, and there were two key shortcomings that curbed its impact. The first was horror. Even then, I felt that Capcom was smack dab in the midst of an identity crisis, and that their genre inversion post Resident Evil 6 had left them hesitant to commit to either angle, be it survival horror or action horror. This leads me to the second, being the gunplay. I said verbatim, the gunplay, while not bad, feels like it's been ripped from a game with much less action, and that if they were going to take the action route, they should commit and make it feel better to play. Usually this kind of stuff would fall on deaf ears, but this time around, though I'm under no illusion that they read my review, Capcom listened. And after witnessing the Resident Evil 4 remake drowning in thanks and praise, they had an idea. A marriage of the genres, and not in the way they had tried before, in a way that made Resident Evil Requiem 2 games in one. And it was bloody genius. It goes without saying that gameplay is paramount in, well, a game, but I think the Resident Evil franchise is unique in this way. I don't need to spin a web of pretty words for you to understand what I mean. These are gamey games. In an industry that often prides itself on escaping the fantasy of video games, foregoing that artificial scaffolding behind the classics in favor of immersion or realism, it's refreshing to see a game treat itself like one. It's all the better for it. So I'm going to split the gameplay section into two mini parts. Up first is Grace channels everything Capcom has learned since Resident Evil Biohazard flipped the franchise on its head, and with the action horror side of the coin landing elsewhere, they could focus fire on making this a damn good survival horror game. You can tell it was a relief to lose the constraint of opposing expectations because the Rhodes Hill Chronic Care Center from start to finish is essentially perfect. Keep in mind the intended experience is in the first-person perspective. It's very possible that less intimate gameplay won't be as engaging. Though the introduction in the Wrenwood Hotel serves its purpose well, it is nothing to Grace's first foray into the care center. That is where the game truly begins. The initial encounter with the girl, as she is called, is Capcom letting the horror in survival horror run wild. She is terrifying. It's a simple concept, a monstrous thing susceptible to light and sensitive to sound, but the execution in this case is something to behold. She's slow and meandering most of the time, but fierce looking with rabbit-like feet and a chain around one ankle that rattles as she approaches. Avoiding her is the usual cat and mouse gameplay, but if it ain't broke, don't fix it. It works just fine here. The entire encounter is a meticulously crafted set piece that sets up how dynamic and varied the rest of the care center will be. This is expressed in Capcom's new approach to zombies, which Leon does call them at some point, so I guess it's canon. I'm glad we're not doing the whole dance around the term with some abstract thing like the Ridden from Back 4 Blood or, I don't know, fucking Deados from the best Ryan Reynolds film. Anyways, think normal zombies infected with the T-virus, but with a caveat. This specific virus leaves behind a few habits and vocalizations from their former lives. Fucking Chef Rush here still mindlessly butchers meat. He tends to vocalize his schedule, and it's a nice way to contextualize how Grace is able to avoid him. The maids scrub mirrors corners and floors obsessively, everything is just so unclean. I think they even try to clean up any mess Grace might have made killing another zombie. The custodians can't allow the lights to be on with no one home, and if Grace turns on any lights, they'll come stumbling in, mumbling about the lights being on. She can use this to get around them as they stay near the last light they switched off, and they hate when you shine a flashlight on them. Every single uptick in enemy variety brings along a new personality to work around in this little sandbox, and there is a ton of variety. Zombies retaining a little humanity has been a thing for ages in media, but it's never been done quite like this, and it makes it even more imperative that you embrace Grace's slower and more methodical playstyle. She's weak and slower than Leon, but she's crafty and resourceful. She can't just steamroll every corridor she walks, and it'd be a shame to miss all this personality. Grace gets by solving puzzles, crafting gadgets, and avoiding enemies. She can fight back, even pretty well, but it's not encouraged. I don't think she runs painfully slow though. It's a bit of a piss take to watch as she gets run up on by an enemy she could have outran on crutches. It's worth mentioning that I have a bit of a problem with the way difficulty is handled in this game, but only with Grace's gameplay. You see, there are 3 difficulties available for a first playthrough. Casual, the easy difficulty, standard, modern, and standard classic. Modern is tailored to modern sensibilities or whatever, but the big takeaway is that you don't need to use a finite resource to save. You do in classic. Grace still has to be in a safe room with a typewriter, but you can run back and save before risking anything. To be clear, a majority of the experience is perfectly intact here, but there is a new crafting resource unique to this game that loses a little mechanical value without the ink ribbons. Along the way, Grace will score a blood collector. She can use it to collect the blood of those infected with the T-virus and repurpose it to craft resources. The kicker is, she needs blood to craft most resources in the game, including ink ribbons. In my eyes, giving the player limited saves is a boon to everything survival horror anyway, but here there's a really interesting dynamic at play too. In one reality, I crafted handgun ammo so I'd have an easier time dealing with a few zombies, but I've hopped on the typewriter without the means to save my progress and had to risk losing it for a longer time. Whereas in another reality, I crafted an ink ribbon, then had a far harder time dealing with this same encounter, but thankfully a guaranteed save once I conquered that. This choice is lost in the easier difficulties, and I wish Capcom had the cojones to make this the default experience. I assure you, it isn't blisteringly difficult and is almost certainly the better choice for most of you. I think anyway. Not one bit of this would mean anything if not for some of the tightest level design I've had the pleasure of experiencing. I already said the Chronic Care Center was perfect, and there's obviously no exception here. Here's that gaminess I mentioned, but in the best sense of the word, and they've done a fantastic job feigning a facility that makes sense, even if it's very convenient in its layout. I adored exploring this place. Every nook and cranny is accounted for, whether it's a tidbit of lore or my second favorite green herb. There's always something to find, and every area perfectly loops back around into itself, offering shortcuts and alternate routes to really make it feel a whole lot more expansive than it actually is. It's a wonder seldom mentioned, a thing Capcom is a master at. These areas are minuscule, but they feel endless and overwhelming as you explore them. Beyond what I've already mentioned, the way Grace interacts with these areas is in classic Resident Evil fashion. And thankfully so, the formula hasn't gotten old yet. There are puzzles abound for you to rack your brain over, though if I can be a bit critical, they're not all that difficult, and that might be a theme with my critique. I think Capcom might have been afraid of turning some people away with a bit of friction, like more difficult puzzles. There's not much puzzle to be found in the inventory management, it's quite simplified. You're most definitely going to need to sacrifice things for inventory space, but there's no Tetris minigame for Grace. It's almost like they've realized that in a survival horror game, the environment deserves the complexity, and a simple inventory and combat system nudges that into the spotlight. It isn't a static sandbox either, it's as lively as can be. You know, things change as Grace progresses, new threats emerge, zombies can feign death and wake up to surprise her, sometimes even mutate into terrifying new enemies. All of this is such a perfect storm of those gamey sensibilities that make everything feel handcrafted to evolve with the player, far above what I expected. Grace's showing is near perfect because of its reliance on a dynamic feeling flurry of systems that are predictable in isolation but volatile as they interact. It's really something to behold. And that brings us to... If Grace was a masterclass in Resident Evil 7, Leon is a masterclass in Resident Evil 4. When I say it's an entirely different game, I mean it. No longer is the environment the point of expression, it's Leon, or you, the player. An ever-present threat to Grace is just another grey hair on Leon's dreamy head. He does not have time to sneak around anything, and the player has no choice in the matter. Leon is the personality here. This combat is a direct evolution of Resident Evil 4, or more specifically the modernized remake, and I bet a little inspired by John Wick. Leon is still his campy, one-liner self, but he's more tactical now, trading a knife for an axe and whatever arsenal he had before for a much bigger one. It flows beautifully. It's been a long time since I've had such a visceral reaction to a combat system in a game. That first little taste of how easy it is for Leon to move through a world Grace and even Ethan would struggle with is magnificent. Look, it's action-oriented with the gameplay to match. They can do it. His weapons are punchy. The sound of bullets ripping through flesh brings such a weight to every micro decision you make in combat. There are contextual finishes for each gun if he's up close. Everything here serves to make you feel as cool as possible. His axe functions pretty much the same as the knife, though there's a little more choice in how he uses it. He can parry and slash, but there are also heavy attacks and finishes when enemies are stunned. There are even contextual finishes for his kicks if you're lucky enough to get one of those. Now, I did say all the personality was rerouted into Leon, and though that rings true, the zombies and monsters still get a little love here. A solid example of this is our beloved chainsaw-wielding infected maniac. There's a ton of attention to detail here, some things you'll probably never see just by virtue of them presenting in unique situations. A zombie might find itself unlucky enough to back up right into the chainsaw, but then walk away with the chainsaw in its back, and then give Leon a great big hug and a chainsaw in the gut. Who the fuck thought of that? That's dumb as fuck. I love it. The game is full of this stuff. They had lightning in a bottle here and they hooked its little bottle nipples up to a car battery and cranked that shit. It's not perfect, and I think it falters a little when compared to, say, The Last of Us Part 2, if not in the combat itself, in the way Leon moves. The world around him is still a little static, and he acts on top of it rather than within it. It's not a big criticism, it's miles above anything else Capcom has given us, and I'm more than appreciative of the major steps they've taken forward, but it's worth noting. Another little smidgen of criticism is again in friction. The game becomes pretty damn easy, and it's no surprise, I expected it, and it's thematically consistent, but I had hoped it wouldn't extend to the boss encounters this time around. They are fantastic in every single way besides difficulty. I ran through them just as well as I'd run through anything in the game. It's all good fun, but I did lament that I wasn't ever as actively engaged as I was with Grace. I get to circle back around to the whole gaminess thing again because hell, it gets even more video game here. It makes absolutely zero sense within the world, but it doesn't matter. Leon gets a combat point system that allows him to buy weapons, equipment, and attachments. It really doesn't make any sense, and I commend them for embracing it in this way because it works. They're pushing you to engage with the systems they've created, and this time it's not about survival, it's about combat and how many notches he has on his belt. It's clear motivation from Capcom, and I'm genuinely all for it. I know I've said the environment takes a backseat here, and it does, understandably so, but that doesn't mean it's bad. The levels are designed more than competently, if a little simpler and more encounter-driven. Look, playing as Leon will feel pretty on rails for a little while initially, but don't be afraid, that's only when Grace is in the spotlight. Leon gets his time to shine later on in the game. I just don't want to spoil much about where it goes. I can talk a little bit more about enemy variety, and it's fantastic. Zombies, big zombies, zombies with chainsaws, zombies with other scary weapons, and there are a whole lot of other monsters I don't want to spoil further down the line. There's a very steady trickle of emerging threats to deal with. While they are less varied individually, on a macro scale, you're still getting the same personality. Oh, and don't let me forget, Leon gets to play Tetris. Fun. There's still quite a bit of crossover between Grace and Leon, and a whole lot of Leon showing contains some things I'd like to let you experience for yourself, so I guess that's why this might feel like a little less of a deep dive. I assure you, there is a lot I wish I could talk about. In conclusion, somehow, somewhere, some genius realized that letting these conflicting genres and gameplay styles coexist alongside each other instead of trying to blend the two was the strongest path forward, and we were lucky enough to witness it. Grace and Leon create a really appealing push and pull throughout that gives us the absolute best of both worlds. I can almost say it's the best the series has ever been. Resident Evil has always been a gameplay first franchise, and this is no exception. But it is exceptional. Following the Resident Evil 2 remake, Capcom has consistently delivered some pretty impressive visual spectacle, beyond the in-game set pieces and delving deep into the granular details, like that burger. What a lovely burger. Yum. Anyways, Resident Evil Requiem hops happily along with that trend, but finds its wings and flies far above what I could have ever expected. On a macro scale, the game exhibits the usual iterative leap forward in fidelity, all of what we'd naturally expect to chug along until we reach a point where games are virtually indistinguishable from real life. Environment geometry and the textures they're wrapped in look great, hair and character models see that little uptick in detail with every release, general particle and volumetric effects are noticeably higher resolution, again, what we'd expect, but there is a standout among that crowd. Before I get into that, it doesn't escape critique completely, though it gets pretty close. Unfortunately, whether it's forced film grain or DLSS's denoising, something can make certain scenes a little hard to look at. Whatever it is, I'm not sure I'll ever understand how a developer misses an issue like this. Granted, it's not noticeable for a majority of the title, but it's present enough in the prologue to turn some unlucky people away. I'm not sure if it's an auto HDR conflict or just a quirk of the RE engine, but brightly lit scenes lack the contrast you'd naturally expect. It's not the worst thing in the world, but there's a noticeable slight washed out look if you're particularly critical of that kind of thing. The game's ray-traced reflections look fantastic. That is, when they are ray-traced. It seemed like a gamble whether a reflection was screen space ray-traced or sometimes it looked like a combination of both. I've heard ray-tracing can conflict with any DLSS denoising technology, so perhaps that was the issue. If there was anything else I noticed, it wasn't significant enough to stick with me, and thankfully now I'm allowed to resume my enthusiastic gushing. Their in-house lighting tech is phenomenal. Some of the best I've ever seen in a game. I always expect a few artifacts here and thereabouts, missing or flickering shadows, overbright exteriors, but I didn't notice a thing. It's then lifted to such great heights with some fancily optimized ray tracing, with path tracing limited to those who could play a game on a cave wall. We don't quite have the technology to justify the performance hit, but it's wonderful to look at nonetheless. Luckily for us, the RE engine is optimized out the wazoo. It is such a breath of fresh air to be able to just play a video game. With all my heart, I hate booting up a new game just to be met with a frame rate you have to settle for. If you'll permit me to be a bit entitled, I didn't pay for a 4090 to play a game that ends up being CPU limited on a 7950X3D. I have played many a game that look like cave paintings compared to this one that couldn't for the life of the developers run half as well. Now, it wasn't perfect, and I was using DLSS, but I'm also playing on 4K with ray tracing cranked to the nines. I don't expect a miracle, but I do expect no discrepancy between graphics and performance. At the very least, I could handle Grace and Leon's sections at a solid 60 FPS with more than enough headroom. If you're planning on using FrameGen, there is stutter in the late game because of it. I've tested it a bit and I think it's a conflict with the ray tracing tech, but I'm not sure, so keep that in mind. I'm very happy with the performance, and this just goes to show that we are not at all limited by our hardware, but by the developers themselves. While Resident Evil 2 demonstrated Capcom's willingness to detail the little things, Resident Evil Requiem does the same for their commitment to animation. Grace gets a ton of love in this regard for sure, but Leon's gameplay is in the third-person perspective primarily, so that's where you'll see the most improvement. His weapon handling in particular is immensely satisfying this time around. Leon, when prompted to reload his handgun, holds his flashlight like your mum might hold a phone while doing the dishes. Or when prompted to reload a shotgun with a long enough stock, he'll invert and shoulder brace it like the absolute tier 1 operator he's become. If Leon is struck or grabbed, when aiming to retaliate, he'll raise his weapon like an outlaw in a standoff. And if he's rounding a corner, he cants and readies his weapon like you'd expect someone trained would. Though there's no point shooting in the game, unfortunately. I don't recall having an issue with the animation work in any of its predecessors, but Resident Evil Requiem has truly set a new standard on this front. Not only that, but the gore. My god, the gore is a sight to behold. There's beauty in the effort that goes into realistic anatomy and injury. I know it sounds a bit morbid, but it's really easy to settle for a bit of blood and call it a day. Not for Capcom though. Eyes pop out, heads explode, and these fucking death scenes. Did these guys play Dead Space a bunch before making this game? I can't remember the last Resident Evil game to put so much effort into something I'd never see. But then I guess I wouldn't know either way. There's such a breadth to their commitment in this one. I love to see it. In the set dressing too. Without spoilers, it's a little less detailed in the later Leon-centric areas, but Grace's domain in the care center is a masterclass in decorating a video game world and providing enough visual variety to keep things interesting. Not only in the environment, but in the enemy design too. Capcom seems to have taken a lesson in subtlety, because while there are still 1,000,001 campy B-movie monster designs, there's also a real effort to make certain enemies creepy in a way that'll fly under the radar for most. Like the hollow-looking eyes on the infected chef, they are bone-chilling. It's fun to notice their priorities change between Grace and Leon, as everything shifts to accommodate jumping back and forth between genres like they do. Beyond the visual, the audio, once I tinkered with the settings a little to be fair, is really second to none. Whether it's the horrifying footsteps of the girl sending shivers down your spine, or the visceral crunch and pang of Leon's axe turning someone's skull into a watermelon with one too many rubber bands wrapped around it. It's subtle and reserved where it needs to be, but exaggerated and loud in just the same way. This extends to the voice acting, which, and this is becoming a trend, is the best it's ever been in a Resident Evil game. I've never been that big a fan of Leon and his campy voice acting, so it was great to see an improvement here on that front, even with the same voice actor. Victor Gideon, one of our antagonists, is fairly quiet and reserved for a villain of his stature. It's a breath of crisp air to see a subtle villain. There's no need to be loud when you look like that. But that's not really what I want to talk about. Grace's voice work is not only the best I've ever heard in a Resident Evil game, but up there with some of the best I've ever heard. Period. Her mother's death is no real spoiler, so I can say that before and after that tragic event is an Emmy-worthy performance, and I'd be furious for the Game Awards to pass her over come time for the next show.
Oh my god. Mom, I feel like I'm gonna throw up.
Grace. Grace, look at me. Grab my hands.
I'm sorry. I am so glad we're done with Ethan's dry ass. I never once believed a word that came out of that man's mouth. Gal Gadot would sit pretty next to him. I want to say I love the music, and I do, but it's often more pragmatic than expressive, and it remains that way for most of the experience. It's perfect for what it is, with callbacks to classic Resident Evil games, some beautiful piano inlaid with the subtle drones you'd expect in a survival horror game. It's all great stuff, really. It's just function over form. Atmosphere. I won't forget to mention that Leon has some tracks seemingly ripped straight from John Wick. I just know they had some inspiration. I know it, and that's where it breaks a little from the pragmatism. I appreciated this sort of levity, if you understand what I mean, and not only the gameplay for Leon, but the music too. Look, I expected to be impressed. Capcom has time and time again promised and delivered some of the best looking and performing games of this generation. But if it wasn't clear enough already, they went big fat balls to the walls with this one.
She won't get away, you know. Dr. Gideon. It's so nice to finally meet you, Leon. Why don't we have a little talk? Would you like to see what's hidden under the hood?
I don't think I've ever actually enjoyed the narrative in a Resident Evil game. I know, let me explain. I'm down with the campiness, and when Capcom strikes a balance, it's a damn joy to be invested in. But the world it all takes place within is the interesting part. The stories themselves aren't all that compelling. In saying that, I kept expecting this one to disappoint me, and while there is no shortage of contrivances and conveniences, it's pretty limited to minor expository plot points, and the skeleton of Grace and Leon's story is a compelling one. That balance I mentioned has been struck perfectly. Capcom has learned to take itself just as seriously as the moment demands. Resident Evil 7 and 8 suffer the opposite, and in trying to reel in stragglers from the franchise's near downfall, it took itself far too seriously. And I don't think Capcom has the wherewithal to deliver an entirely grounded narrative, if I'm honest. I really think they felt that too, and it's fantastic to see them playing to their strengths, with a compelling undertone to drive the rest of it all. Our story begins with Grace Ashcroft, an FBI analyst investigating a series of mysterious deaths. The kicker is that every single one of those cadavers hail from the one and only Raccoon City. Grace is the daughter of Resident Evil Outbreak's protagonist, Alyssa Ashcroft, who we learn had died years before in just the same place she's being sent to investigate, without backup, just a little gun in her backpack. It's silly, but there's an explanation for it later on that was good enough for me. Anyhow, Grace is soon made aware that someone has been stalking her for years. She recovers a data disk left behind by her mother all those years before and is summarily attacked and kidnapped by Victor Gideon, a monstrous scientist that needs Grace for a thing he only alludes to. By the luck of the stars, Leon is on the case too, but not because he has to be, because he and Sherry Birkin are exhibiting symptoms much too similar to those deaths under investigation and are aching for answers. Gideon manages to escape by forcing Leon into the middle of another T-virus outbreak and whisks poor old Grace away to the Rhodes Hill Chronic Care Center. That's it for my exposition dump. This is a fairly compelling story throughout, and it wraps up in a way that felt satisfying, earned, and like it has genuine consequences in universe. Resident Evil has always featured very memorable characters, but seldom are they as captivating as they are here. Leon needs no introduction, but there's an emotional core to his story that was always missing in previous installments. Grace does admittedly seem like she'll get annoying, stuttering like you up on stage that one time at school way back when. Remember that? You do now. Anyhow, Capcom has smartly offset her frail physicality with problem-solving skills displayed in a manner beyond any choice the player makes during gameplay. She's cunning and is determined despite her disadvantages. I'd say Victor Gideon is a highlight among the cast, a villain mighty in stature, but reserved and surprisingly graceful in motion. A terrifying visage with a confident but soft cadence that permeates any room he's in. Such a refreshing take on a villain. Capcom could have easily made the carpet match the drapes, in his demeanor I mean, but they elected to give him more depth than that. It's impressive restraint for a studio responsible for all of Leon's one-liners, from that little book of one-liners he keeps in his back pocket. I think sitting on that little book is why his posture is so fucking bad. There is more to that colorful cast of characters I promised. Much more, but I hate spoilers, and I want you to share this experience with me. I went in almost completely blind, and I was better for it, so I'm doing my damnedest to keep it that way for you, just in case. In all honesty, Capcom hasn't written anything revolutionary, but in a game striking almost every little cylinder in gameplay and presentation, it only needs to be a solid motivator for those two things. I commend Capcom for making it just a little bit more than that. It may not reinvent the wheel, but it spins it well enough. Hey, if you're still with me, I'm James, and this is TheWaffleIron. I like to rate my games a little differently, like waffles, hot off the iron, from raw, right on through to crispy, golden perfection. And if the bite is right, maybe a dash of syrup. While that's cooking, I think we should have a little chat about the price of this game, and whether the runtime is worth that price. I've seen whispers in dark, wretched corners of the internet, Reddit, that this game offers around 10 hours of bang for your buck, give or take. But that is either intentionally misleading or obtuse. If someone refers to the time logged in-game for any given playthrough, that does not account for any repetition if you die or reload a save. Assuming you're not playing on the casual difficulty, I'd wager this will take you anywhere from 12 to 15 hours to get through. Even more if you like to be thorough, like I do. Now, I'd also like to delineate between two separate conversations about price. The first is whether this game is worth the price, and I'd say it is. The second is whether any game should cost this much, and I say no, probably not. I know that seems contradictory, but I don't think this game is responsible for the markup in price, so I think we should grade it within the economy now, instead of a time we're nostalgic for. And understandably so, by the way. With that in the rearview mirror, Resident Evil Requiem is the best game I've ever reviewed on this channel. A testament to Capcom's willingness to let this franchise mature alongside its audience, without forsaking what made Resident Evil what it is today. A marriage of the two conflicting genres they flip-flopped between for a decade, and a healthy one at that. There is certainly room to improve, and this is not a perfect score, but every time I thought to bump it down a peg, it just felt wrong, you know? I had far too much good old fucking fun for it to be anything less than, and this is the first of its kind, golden. And because I just adore how tactically cool they've made my baby daddy Leon, a dash of syrup too.